1. Language and liberty. History is in part not only a long struggle for the minds, bodies, and properties of men, with various movements seeking control of historical processes in terms of their faith, but it is also a battle with respect to language. An instrument of power at Babel, language was, according to Scripture, confused by God in order to create diversity and the possibility of separate and integral developments. Men fail to understand one another not only when they speak alien tongues, but also when they use the same words with very diverse meanings. Communists and conservatives, US Republicans alike, use the word, quote, republic, end quote, but with radically different interpretations. Christians and relativists both speak of law with no identity of meaning. Again, the definition of liberty is not limited to its 9 dictionary definitions, but has, in its civil and religious connotations, almost as many meanings as there are political parties and religions in existence. As a result, the very fact of a common tongue and an identical word can sometimes, on the presupposition of a necessary cultural unity, further the confusion of speech. As a result, many cults and movements have sought at times a private and esoteric speech, only to find that staleness and flatness of definition from lack of public conflict. Moreover, in general usage, words and communication forms change, and they sometimes change so slowly that the erosion is imperceptible even when complete. The world of art gives many startling illustrations of this process. Thus, one of the central triumphs of the Christian faith, often celebrated in Christian art, was the ascension of Christ. The glorious victory was gradually altered, without any radical changes at any one time, to emphasize not only the human form of Christ, but also the pictorial qualities currently of interest. The Ascension formula became the vehicle also of pictures of the Assumption of the Virgin Mary, and then, as Mary became more and more an attractive woman rather than a religious principle, the picture became openly an avowed glorification of Venus. A telling instance of this change is found in the work of Peter Paul Rubens, 1577 to 1640, as witness his Apotheosis of the Duke of Buckingham and the Apotheosis of James I. Rubens seemed unaware of the blasphemy involved in his paintings. Again, in Rubens's Nature Adorned by the Graces, there is a total absence of the Franciscan view of nature as God's creation. Rather, we see the many-breasted Diana of the Ephesians. Every trace of a Christian conception of nature is missing. Rubens thus moved in a world where Christ ruled in the church and pagan nature governed the world. A confusion in language and communication reflects usually a cultural confusion, but not necessarily a personal confusion. Many a man uses the language implying an alien faith without an awareness of the divergence of meaning. A major instance of this is the usage of such terms as reason, natural law, social contract or compact, and related ones in the 17th and especially 18th centuries. A contemporary historian has remarked on the coincidence of language and divergence of meanings among various parties in France before and during the Revolution. This was no less true of colonial America. The refusal to recognize this divergence of meaning is behind the common ascription of deism to many 18th century Americans. Actually, deism was a late arrival in America and very slight in extent and influence prior to the American Revolution. The language of reason and nature had a long philosophical and legal history and was by no means the property of any one school. In 1632, the Royal Charter to Maryland stipulated that the laws of its legislative body must be, quote, consonant to reason, end quote. In 1644, the Presbyterian Samuel Rutherford in Lex Rex cited Aristotle and Aquinas and appealed to, quote, God and nature, end quote. In 1645, the Ancient Bounds, an independent statement of the case for liberty of conscience, declared, quote, "For this is a rule, the law of nature supersedes institutions. Men have a natural being before they come to have a spiritual being. They are men before they are Christians. Now, therefore, for faultiness in Christianity, you must not destroy the man." End quote. In 1647, Richard Overton, in an appeal from the Commons to the Free People, based his argument on quote-unquote reason. In 1649, the True Leveller's Standard Advanced spoke of, quote, "the great creator, reason," end quote. A common language was appealed to, but with widely divergent meanings. When the pressure of this divergence of meanings brought about a collapse into meaninglessness of the words, then new words such as, quote, "democracy," end quote, began to supplant the eroded terms. As has been noted, many men use words which to others imply a religious view not held by the speaker or writer without an awareness either of the divergence of meaning or the mixed presuppositions. Witness, for example, the Reverend John Witherspoon, 1722 to 1794, a Presbyterian leader who in 1768 assumed the presidency of the College of New Jersey, now Princeton University. Witherspoon taught many who later played an active role in American life. His own belief in sound money, mixed government, and a division of powers was pronounced. An orthodox Calvinist, Witherspoon, without any sense of contradiction, also followed the philosophy of Thomas Reid, 1710 to 1796, Scottish realism, using this questionable tool against Hume, deism, and French philosophers. In his Lectures on Moral Philosophy, he spoke the language of rights and reason, combining with this man-centered emphasis his own theocentric faith. Witherspoon's students, profoundly influenced by him, reached positions of eminence in the Constitutional Convention and in early United States history. They included a president, vice president, 10 cabinet officers, 21 senators, 39 congressmen, and 12 governors, as well as other public figures. All these were affected by Witherspoon's Calvinism, classicism, and common sense philosophy. This confusion, however, was slight in contrast to other phenomena of the American scene. Thus, in 1642, in Maryland, a group of, quote, "Protestant Catholics," end quote, filed complaints against Thomas Gerard, Lord of St. Clement's Manor and an influential Roman Catholic planter, for depriving them of their books and the key to their chapel. About a century later, Pennsylvania saw a Protestant, Conrad Beissel, a religious hermit, establish his Ephrata colony, the Colico cloisters, with men and women submitting to sacerdotal celibacy and asceticism. The Puritans of New England and colonials elsewhere combined a horror of Rome with a dedication to scholasticism, as James J. Walsh has shown in the Education of the Founding Fathers of the Republic, 1935, a study of scholasticism at Harvard, William and Mary, Yale, Princeton, Pennsylvania, Columbia, and Brown. The reliance of the Puritans on the logic of the Aristotelian Peter Ramus, died 1572, has been well documented by Perry Miller in The New England Mind, the 17th Century. John Cotton, 1585 to 1652, Puritan divine whose able exposition of 1 John has been reprinted as late as 1962, noted the extensive influence of the, quote, "schoolmen," end quote. Scholasticism in philosophy, which gave much authority to man's unaided reason, was increasingly combined with Puritanism in theology. Furthermore, natural law had, as C.W. McIlwain in The American Revolution, a constitutional interpretation points out, a legal status in that it was held to be, quote, "engrafted into the British Constitution," end quote, so that appeals to it was not only philosophical and theological, but also juridical. The language of the day was thus not the property of deism, but of all parties. But were not Benjamin Franklin and Thomas and Jefferson very obviously deists? That both were familiar with deism goes without saying. Franklin also greatly admired the evangelist Whitefield, and yet was on the fringes, at the very least, of the infamous Hellfire Club in England. He was also a member of the Neuf Sœurs, which held a commemorative assembly on his death. Jedediah Morse charged Jefferson with being an Illuminatus. While Jefferson denied this charge, he still defended Weishaupt as, quote, an enthusiastic philanthropist, end quote. Federalism was, as Merle Curti pointed out in The Growth of American Thought, 1943, the American reaction against the Enlightenment. The Jeffersonian Republicans represented a party favourable to France, and yet were in actuality closer to the Federalists, at times furthering policies inimical to Jacobin theory, than they were to the Enlightenment and to France. The differences between Republicans and the European Enlightenment were far greater and more basic than the differences between Federalists and Republicans. The issues between these two parties became increasingly more and more sectional and local rather than philosophical. Jefferson spoke with no small measure of truth when he observed, quote, we are all Republicans, we are all Federalists, end quote. The eclectic approach of both Franklin and Jefferson to all things made them ready samplers of any thought, but were they deists? Virgilus Firm has defined deism as, first, the view that, quote, God has no immediate relation with the world, the absentee landlord view, end quote, and second that, quote, revelation is superfluous, that reason is touchstone to religious validity, that religion and ethics are natural phenomena, that the traditional God need hardly be appealed to, since man finds in nature the necessary guides for moral and religious living, end quote. In terms of this, let us examine the plea for public prayer given by Benjamin Franklin on June 28, 1787, at the Constitutional Convention. Quote, in this situation of this assembly, groping as it were in the dark to find the political truth, and scarce able to distinguish it when presented to us, how has it happened, sir, that we have not hitherto once thought of humbly applying to the Father of lights to illuminate our understandings? In the beginning of the contest with Great Britain, when we were sensible to danger, we had daily prayers in this room for divine protection. Our prayers, sir, were heard, and they were graciously answered. All of us who were engaged in the struggle must have observed frequent instances of a superintending providence in our favour. To that kind of providence we owe this happy opportunity of consulting in peace on the means of establishing our future national felicity. And have we now forgotten that powerful friend? Or do we imagine that we no longer need his assistance? I have lived, sir, a long time, and the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs the affairs of men. And if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable an empire can rise without his aid? We have been assured, sir, in the sacred writings that except the Lord build the house, they labour in vain that build it. I firmly believe this, and I also believe that without this concurring aid, we shall succeed in this political building no better than the builders of Babel. We shall be divided by our partial little local interests. Our projects will be confounded, and we ourselves shall become a byword down the future ages. And what is worse, mankind may hereafter, from this unfortunate instance, despair of establishing governments by human wisdom, and leave it to chance, war, and conquest. End quote. Consider also these earnest words of Thomas Jefferson, quote, can the liberties of a nation be sure when we remove their only firm basis, a conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are the gift of God, that they are not to be violated but with his wrath? Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever, that a revolution of the wheel of fortune, a change of situation, is among possible events, that it may become probable by supernatural interference. The Almighty has no attribute which can take side with us in that event. End quote. That both these men were influenced by deism, among other things, is certainly to be granted, but unless one writes these statements off as the most Arendt's kind of hypocrisy, it becomes equally clear that even stronger colonial influences were at work. Here, in clear and forthright language from these men, is Calvinism's predestination and total providence, and at the same time the near Unitarian exclusion of Christ from the Godhead. God is not seen as an absentee landlord, and not merely reason, but more than reason is appealed to. It becomes clear that, in view of the mixed linguistic, religious, and philosophical premises, no facile classification can be ventured. To call Jefferson and Franklin deists is as erroneous as to call Jonathan Edwards either a Calvinist or a latter-day champion of New England orthodoxy. Edwards was strongly influenced by Platonism, disregarded the basic New England faith in a holy commonwealth, was a thorough empiricist, and sought to ground Christian faith on Locke and Newton. In terms of this, he could affirm that, quote, "It is self-evident, I believe, to every man that space is necessary, eternal, infinite, and omnipresent. But I had as good speak plain. I have already said as much as that space is God, and it is indeed clear to me that all the space there is, not proper to body, all the space there is without the bounds of creation, all the space there was before the creation, is God himself, and nobody would in the least pick at it, if it were not because of the gross conceptions that we have of space." End quote. Many of Edwards' ostensibly, quote, liberal, end quote, critics were, in terms of New England orthodoxy, more conservative than he. Edwards' emphasis on experimental religion was the analogue of the Arminian emphasis on works and the empirical demand for phenomena. Theologically, some of the implications of Edwards' position are more radical than anything in Franklin, while other elements are intensely conservative. Classification can thus be falsification. However, our current classifications are not to be despised. They are the product of a development, refinement, distillation, and self-analysis of thought, and are excellent scholarly tools. Without them, historical research would become meaningless. But it must not be forgotten that colonial America must also be understood in terms of the meaning and purpose of man and society in their day, in terms of their faith, inheritance, and goal. The linguistic confusion and the philosophical confusion must be noted, as well as the quote-unquote bandwagon use of language, the association of varying ideas around a concept which has gained currency. As we shall see, this social contract, which meant to continental philosophers and deism a status concept, a contract between people and state, meant, as did the laws of nature and of reason, a strongly anti-status concept to the Americans. For them, it represented their feudal-born concept of local and federal government, limited in nature. Although they often assumed that continental thinkers meant what Americans did, they nonetheless held to a very different concept and developed their civil polity into channels markedly in contrast to the French Revolution. A language which elsewhere pointed to statism in America was a vehicle of native conceptions of liberty. The studied rootlessness, based on scientific and rationalistic premises, which the French Revolution sought, was anathema to Jefferson, a friend of the French, and on such grounds Jefferson saw little hope for independence movements in South America. Quote, "They will fall under military despotism and become the murderous tools of their respective Bonapartes." End quote. Both the closeness and distance of Jefferson to French thought can be cited. The major factor was a differing tradition, and Jefferson's roots in that American tradition. Jefferson cannot be understood apart from an understanding of these particular roots. Men speak not only in a verbal language, but also in the language of history, in the context and meaning of their time and place. It was the language of American colonial history which was written into the Constitution of the United States. With reference to the European and classical sources so often cited by the shapers of American history, quote, "Not only Locke and Montesquieu, but Aristotle and Cicero and Plutarch, Hobbes, Burlamaqui, Milton, Hooker, Bolingbroke, Blackstone, Burke, Shaftesbury, and a score of collateral branches, end quote. Burnham's comment is apropos, quote, but the fathers were the masters, not the victims of these inherited ideas, and sometimes it is the rhetoric more than the ideas that is taken over. The fathers were protected from ideology, not only by piety and a native skepticism toward abstract reason, but by their persistent sense of fact, of the specific, end quote. In spite of this pragmatic usage, there was, however, an element of philosophical indistinction which must be recognized. The epistemological self-consciousness granted by 2 centuries of development cannot be read backwards into history, but neither can modern secularism be so read into it. To speak, therefore, of an, quote, American Enlightenment, end quote, is to attempt to read into the revolution a later development in American thought. Again, to seek there the developed Christian orthodoxy of the day is also to misread history